6 months ago, my parents stood in my living room demanding I sell my house to save theirs. Today, they're standing on my doorstep homeless. But they're about to get the shock of their lives. Hi everyone, I'm Madison, and I'm sharing this story because I know many of you have felt invisible in your own families. If this resonates with you, please subscribe. There's a powerful lesson about self-worth coming at the end that changed everything for me. Growing up as the younger sister to Derek, I learned early that love in our family came with conditions. Derek was 3 years older, charming, and had this infectious optimism that made everyone believe his next big idea would change the world. I was the quiet one, the one who got straight A's, worked part-time jobs through high school, and somehow always faded into the background whenever Derek walked into a room. The pattern started when I was 14. It was my 8th grade graduation ceremony, and I'd been chosen as valedictorian. I remember standing in my cap and gown that morning, so excited to see my parents in the audience. But when I looked out from the stage, their seats were empty. They'd driven Derek to Chicago instead for some startup pitch competition he'd entered last minute. "Madison will understand," my mom had said, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. Derek's presentation could change his entire future. That night, when they came home with Derek clutching a third-place trophy, they barely glanced at my valedictorian certificate on the kitchen table. "That's nice, honey," Dad said, but his eyes were still shining with pride for Derek's achievement. I learned something that day that would follow me for years. My accomplishments would always be nice. But Derek's dreams were family priorities. College was when the financial inequality became impossible to ignore. I'd worked 2 jobs senior year, saved every penny, and earned a partial scholarship to study computer science at Northwestern. But tuition was still steep, and I needed help with living expenses. The same week I got my acceptance letter, Derek announced he was dropping out of his business program at DePaul to start his first company, something about revolutionizing food delivery before apps like that existed. "We believe in Derek's vision," Dad explained when I asked about tuition help. "This could make our family wealthy, Madison. Your degree will get you a steady job, but Derek's thinking bigger." They liquidated my college fund, the one my grandmother had started when I was born, and handed Derek $40,000 to rent office space and hire developers. I'll never forget sitting in the financial aid office, explaining to the counselor why my expected family contribution suddenly disappeared. "Sometimes families change their priorities," she said gently, helping me apply for additional loans. I graduated with $68,000 in debt, while Derek's food delivery company folded after 8 months. "The market wasn't ready," Derek explained at Thanksgiving dinner that year, already pitching his next idea. "But I learned so much, and the next venture will be different." My parents nodded supportively, while I silently calculated loan payments on my phone. The birthday incident when I turned 26 still stings. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, not because I expected anything elaborate, but because it fell on a Saturday, and for once, we'd all be free for dinner. I'd made reservations at Mum's favourite Italian place and even offered to pay, just wanting one evening where I felt like I mattered. That morning, Derek called in a panic. His second startup, some kind of social media platform for pet owners, was hemorrhaging users, and he'd managed to schedule an emergency meeting with potential investors for that exact evening. "They're only available tonight," he pleaded. "Madison, you'll understand, right? This could save everything." I sat alone at Romano's that night, eating breadsticks and explaining to the waiter that my party wasn't coming after all. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the text from Mom 3 hours later. "Sorry, honey, Derek's meeting went so well. Rain check on birthday dinner. There was no rain check. There never was. But the moment that truly broke something inside me happened 2 years ago when I ended up in the emergency room with what turned out to be appendicitis. I was living alone then, working as a software engineer at a tech startup downtown, and the pain hit me like lightning around 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. I called Mum first, barely able to speak through the agony. "Oh, honey, that sounds awful," she said, but I could hear distraction in her voice. "Your father and I are at Derek's apartment, though. He's having a crisis about his latest investor presentation tomorrow. Can you call an Uber to the hospital? We'll try to come by later." They never came. I underwent emergency surgery at midnight, spent 2 days recovering alone, and took a week off work without a single family visit. Derek's presentation, meanwhile, was a disaster. The investors passed, his third company folded within a month, and by the time I was back on my feet, they were already focused on his next brilliant idea. That's when I realized the truth that had been staring me in the face for years. I wasn't really their daughter. I was their backup plan, their safety net, their reliable child who would always be okay so they could pour their energy into Derek's chaos. When Derek needed them, they dropped everything. When I needed them, I got sympathetic words and empty promises. And the pattern was so consistent, it became predictable. Derek would launch a business with grand promises and infectious enthusiasm. My parents would invest time, money, and emotional energy. The business would fail spectacularly. There would be a brief period of disappointment, followed immediately by excitement about Derek's next revolutionary idea. Rinse and repeat. Through it all, I kept working, kept achieving, kept building my own life. I bought a small house in Lincoln Park when I was 28, a charming 2-bedroom craftsman that I loved. I got promoted to senior engineer, then team lead, then CTO of a promising startup called CloudBridge that was developing data management solutions for healthcare companies. My life was stable, successful, and almost entirely separate from my family's roller coaster. But Derek's failures were getting more expensive. His fourth venture, something about blockchain-based real estate transactions, burned through $80,000 of my parents' retirement savings. His fifth, a subscription box service for artisanal coffee, cost them their second mortgage. Each time, they assured me it was the last time that Derek had learned his lessons, that the next idea would be the one that paid everything back. I watched from the sidelines as my parents' financial security evaporated, always wondering why they never seemed to consider that their stable, successful daughter might be worth investing in too. When CloudBridge started gaining serious traction and I was featured in a Tech Leaders Under 35 article in Chicago Magazine, my parents shared Derek's latest LinkedIn post about disrupting the hospitality industry instead. The breaking point came last spring when Derek announced his most ambitious project yet. He'd been reading about cryptocurrency and blockchain technology and somehow convinced himself that he'd discovered a gap in the market that no one else had noticed. He was going to create a blockchain-based platform that would revolutionize how people invested in real estate. "This isn't like the other businesses," he told our parents during a family dinner I reluctantly attended. "This is bigger than anything I've done before. We're talking about changing how property ownership works forever. But I need serious capital to make it happen. We're talking about building an entire ecosystem from scratch." I watched my parents' eyes light up with familiar hope. Despite 5 consecutive failures, despite their dwindling savings, despite being in their early 60s, with almost nothing left for retirement, they were ready to believe again. "How much capital?" Dad asked, leaning forward like Derek was about to reveal the secret to eternal youth. $750,000 to start, Derek said casually, as if he was asking to borrow $20 for gas. I know it sounds like a lot, but this is our chance to not just get back everything we've lost, but to set our family up for life. I nearly choked on my wine. Derek, you can't be serious. Where would they even get that kind of money? The house, he said simply. It's worth $800,000 now with the market boom. We take out a bridge loan against the equity. I build the platform, bring in investors, and pay it back, plus interest within 18 months. My parents owned their house outright. It was the only financial security they had left. Dad had inherited it from his father, and it represented 40 years of mortgage payments and property value appreciation. It was supposed to be their safety net, their guarantee that no matter what happened, they'd have a roof over their heads. That's insane, I said, looking between my parents' excited faces and Derek's confident smile. You're talking about gambling the house on another startup. Derek, your track record is full of valuable learning experiences, Derek interrupted smoothly. Every successful entrepreneur fails multiple times before they succeed. Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, they all had failures. The difference is they didn't quit, and neither will I. Those guys didn't risk their parents' home on every idea, I shot back. Madison, Mum said gently, you've always been more conservative than Derek. But sometimes you have to take big risks to achieve big rewards. Your brother has learned so much from his previous ventures. This time feels different. Different. It always felt different to them. Derek had a gift for making each new disaster sound like an inevitable triumph waiting to happen. The blockchain market is crashing, I pointed out. Crypto is down 70% from its peak. This is literally the worst possible time to launch a blockchain startup. That's exactly why it's the perfect time, Derek explained, with the patience of someone talking to a child. When everyone else is scared, that's when the real opportunities appear. We'll be positioned perfectly for the market recovery. Dad was already nodding. It makes sense, Madison. Buy low, sell high. Isn't that what they say? I felt like I was watching my parents walk toward a cliff while Derek handed them blindfolds. This isn't buying a stock that might go down, I said desperately. This is betting your house on Derek's ability to build something that's never been built before, in a market that's actively hostile to new blockchain projects, with money you can't afford to lose. We're not losing anything, Derek said confidently. I've already got 3 potential investors lined up. Once they see the prototype, the money will start flowing. This isn't like my other businesses. This is backed by solid technology and market research. I'd heard variations of this speech 5 times before, the investors who were ready to write checks but needed to see more progress first. The market research that somehow always missed crucial details about competition and timing. The solid business plan that always had 1 or 2 small issues that would definitely be resolved in the next iteration. But my parents were already mentally spending their blockchain millions. They talked excitedly about paying off Derek's student loans, taking the European vacation they'd been postponing for years, maybe buying a second home. They'd forgotten completely that this was borrowed money secured by their primary residence. Within 2 weeks, they'd signed the papers. $750,000 secured by their home, with an 18-month repayment timeline and enough interest to make a loan shark blush. Derek assured them the timeline was conservative. He expected to have major investors signed within 6 months. I tried one last time to talk sense into them. Please, I said to Mom privately while Derek was setting up his new office space. Please think about this. What if it doesn't work? What if it's like all the other times? Oh, honey, she said, patting my hand like I was still 10 years old. You worry too much. Derek's different now, more focused, more mature. And even if something did go wrong, we'd figure it out. We always do. But I knew they wouldn't figure it out. I knew exactly what would happen when Derek's blockchain revolution crashed and burned like all his previous revolutions. They'd call me, crying and desperate, expecting their reliable daughter to sell her house and bail them out. Because that's what the responsible child does, right? Clean up the messes that the golden child leaves behind. Derek's platform was supposed to launch in October. By November, he was asking for extensions on the loan. By December, his 3 potential investors had all passed. By January, he was pivoting to a different blockchain model. By February, he was exploring strategic partnerships to keep the project alive. By March, he was gone. Derek disappeared one Tuesday morning, leaving behind a half-finished website, an empty office, and a note explaining that he'd taken a temporary consulting position in California to explore new opportunities and gain fresh perspective. The note didn't mention the $750,000, the 18-month deadline that was now 12 months away, or his parents who were about to lose their home. That's when my phone started ringing. Mum called first, her voice shaky and small. Madison, honey, we need to talk. Could you come over for dinner this weekend? There's been a situation with Derek's business. A situation. As if Derek's complete abandonment of his latest catastrophe was just an unfortunate miscommunication that could be resolved with good intentions and positive thinking. I knew what was coming before I walked through their front door that Saturday evening. I could see it in Dad's slumped shoulders, in Mum's red-rimmed eyes, in the way they both looked at me like I was their last hope instead of their daughter. We need your help, Dad said without preamble, his voice hollow. Derek's project. It didn't work out, and the loan has to be repaid in full by next March, Mum finished. $750,000 plus interest. Madison, we'll lose the house. They looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to ask what I could do to help, how we could solve this together, what sacrifices I'd be willing to make to save the family home. Because that's what good daughters do. They fix things, they sacrifice, they make everything okay again. Instead, I asked a different question. Where's Derek? He's in San Francisco, Mum said quickly. Working with some investors on a new project. He feels terrible about how things turned out, but he's trying to raise money to pay us back. He's been gone for 6 weeks, I pointed out. Have you heard from him at all since he left? They exchanged glances. He's been very busy, Dad said defensively, setting up meetings, networking. These things take time. Derek had abandoned them, just like he'd abandoned 5 previous business ventures when they became inconvenient or difficult. But my parents couldn't see it yet, or maybe they just couldn't accept it. Either way, they were looking at me to solve a problem that Derek had created and then run away from. We were hoping, Mum said carefully, that maybe you could help us with the loan, just temporarily, until Derek gets his new funding sorted out. You have your house, and it's worth more now than when you bought it. If you could take out an equity loan. They wanted me to risk my home to pay for Derek's failure. The house I'd bought with my own money, secured with my own career, maintained with my own hands. They wanted me to bet my future on Derek's promises, just like they had. You want me to mortgage my house to pay Derek's debt, I said slowly. It's not Derek's debt, Dad said quickly. It's our debt. We signed the papers, we're responsible, but Derek will pay us back, and then you wouldn't be out anything. It's just a temporary bridge loan. Temporary. Just like Derek's consulting position in California was temporary. Just like his commitment to the blockchain project had been temporary. Just like his presence in his parents' lives whenever things got difficult was always temporary. I looked around the living room where I'd grown up, at the family photos that lined the mantel. Derek's graduation pictures, Derek's award ceremonies, Derek cutting ribbons at his various business launches. There was one photo of me, my college graduation, tucked behind a larger frame showcasing Derek's acceptance into his business program. Even now, facing financial ruin because of Derek's decisions, they couldn't bring themselves to hold him accountable. It was easier to ask me to fix everything, because I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who always said yes when family needed help. But for the first time in my 32 years, I was going to say no. "I'm not giving you money to cover Derek's failure," I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Mum's face crumpled like I'd slapped her. Dad stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Madison," Mum whispered, "this is our home. We raised you here. We're family." "Family," I repeated. "When Derek needed money for college, you gave him my inheritance. When Derek needed support for his businesses, you emptied your retirement accounts. When Derek needed someone to believe in him after every failure, you were there. But when I graduated as valedictorian, you missed it for Derek's presentation. When I was in the hospital having surgery, you stayed with Derek because he was nervous about a meeting. When I bought my house, when I got promoted, when I was featured in that magazine article, none of it mattered because Derek always had something more important happening." My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. Years of swallowed disappointment were finally finding their way to the surface. "You've never treated me like family," I continued. "You've treated me like a backup plan. Derek gets unconditional love and unlimited chances. I get asked to clean up his messes when the consequences become inconvenient for you." "That's not fair," Dad said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "We love you both equally." "No, you don't." "And you know what? That's okay. I've built a good life without depending on your love or approval. But I'm not going to risk everything I've worked for to enable Derek's irresponsibility one more time." I stood up to leave, and Mom grabbed my arm. "Please," she said, tears streaming down her face, "please, don't do this to us. We're your parents. We need you." For just a moment, looking at her desperate face, I almost caved, almost said yes, like I'd been trained to do my entire life, almost sacrificed my security for their poor choices. But then I remembered 14-year-old me, sitting alone at my graduation ceremony, 26-year-old me, eating birthday dinner by myself, 29-year-old me, recovering from surgery with no visitors, all the times I'd needed them, and they'd chosen Derek instead. "You made your choice," I said gently. "You chose Derek's dreams over everything else, including your own financial security. I'm not going to make the same mistake." I walked out of their house that night knowing I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But for the first time in my life, I'd chosen myself over their dysfunction, and it felt like taking my first real breath. The calls started immediately. Mum, crying and pleading. Dad, angry and accusatory. Even Derek, suddenly reachable now that there was a crisis to manage, calling from California to explain why I was being selfish and short-sighted. "Madison, this is bigger than just money," Derek said during one particularly manipulative phone call. "This is about family loyalty. Mom and Dad sacrificed everything for us. Now it's our turn to sacrifice for them." "Our turn?" I laughed bitterly. "Derek, you're the one who took their money and disappeared. You're the one who convinced them to bet their house on your pipe dream. Where's your sacrifice in all this?" "I'm working 18-hour days trying to raise money to pay them back," he protested. "You're working 18-hour days trying to fund your next startup," I corrected. "Just like always, and when that one fails, you'll disappear again and leave someone else to deal with the consequences." "You're being really unfair right now," Derek said, and I could hear the hurt in his voice, the same hurt he'd perfected as a child whenever he was called out for breaking something or lying about homework. "Am I?" I asked. "Name one time, one single time, you took responsibility for a failed business instead of moving on to the next idea." The silence stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "That's what I thought," I said, and hung up. I changed my phone number the next week, blocked them on social media. When they showed up at my house, unannounced, I didn't answer the door. I was done being their safety net, their backup plan, their reliable child who would always be there to fix Derek's messes. It wasn't easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was making a terrible mistake, if I was destroying my family over pride and old resentments. But then I'd remember that they'd already destroyed our family. They just expected me to keep pretending everything was okay. For the first time in my adult life, I was free. Free from the constant low-level anxiety about Derek's next crisis. Free from the exhausting dynamic of being the responsible child who got no credit but all the expectations. Free to build relationships with people who actually valued me for who I was, not what I could provide when times got tough. That's when I met Marcus. Marcus Williams was nothing like anyone I'd ever dated. Where my previous relationships had been with fellow tech workers or startup entrepreneurs, guys who understood my career but often competed with it, Marcus was grounded in a completely different world. He was a senior partner at Hartwell & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, specializing in corporate fraud and white-collar crime. We met at a networking event for Chicago's young professionals. I was there representing Cloudbridge, hoping to make connections in the healthcare sector. He was there because his firm often worked with tech companies dealing with regulatory compliance. What started as a conversation about data privacy laws turned into 3 hours of talking about everything except work. Marcus was tall, with dark hair that was always perfectly styled but somehow never looked uptight. He had this way of listening, really listening, that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. When I told him about Cloudbridge's mission to streamline healthcare data management, he asked thoughtful questions about patient privacy and security protocols. When I mentioned growing up in Chicago, he wanted to know about my favorite neighborhoods and hidden restaurants. But what struck me most was how he reacted when I briefly mentioned my family situation. I didn't go into details that first night, just a casual comment about being the only non-entrepreneur in a family of dreamers. Most people either changed the subject or started sharing their own family drama. Marcus just nodded and said, "That must be complicated sometimes." Complicated. Such a simple word, but it felt like the first time someone had acknowledged that family dynamics aren't always straightforward, that being the stable one isn't always easy. We started dating slowly. Marcus was patient about my reluctance to introduce him to my family, never pushing for explanations I wasn't ready to give. He seemed to understand instinctively that I was protecting something fragile. Not just our relationship, but my own peace of mind. 3 months into dating, Marcus finally met my parents by accident. We'd been out for dinner in Lincoln Park when we ran into them at a coffee shop. Derek was visiting from California, and the 3 of them were huddled around a table covered with printouts and business plans. Derek was animatedly explaining his latest venture, while my parents nodded along with familiar enthusiasm. "Madison!" Mum called out when she spotted us, her voice artificially bright. "What a surprise! Come say hello." I introduced Marcus reluctantly, watching my family size him up. Derek immediately launched into his elevator pitch about revolutionizing sustainable energy storage, assuming Marcus would be impressed by his innovation. Dad started asking about Marcus's work, clearly hoping he might be a potential investor. Marcus was polite but distant, answering their questions without volunteering additional information. When Derek suggested we all grab dinner together to discuss synergies between our industries, Marcus smoothly declined, citing an early morning meeting. In the Uber afterward, Marcus was quiet for several blocks before finally speaking. "Your brother's in trouble, isn't he?" I stared out the window at the city lights. "What makes you say that?" "I've seen enough fraud cases to recognize the signs. The overly complex business model, the vague explanations of how the technology actually works, the focus on raising money rather than developing products. Plus, your parents looked exhausted. People don't look that worn down from excitement. That's stress and fear." "Derek's always been a dreamer," I said carefully. "There's a difference between dreamers and con artists," Marcus replied gently. "Sometimes the people closest to the situation are the last ones to see it clearly." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. Marcus never pushed me to talk about my family, but he started sharing stories about his own work. Cases where well-meaning people had been manipulated by charismatic fraudsters, families torn apart by financial schemes. The warning signs that often went unrecognized until it was too late. "The hardest cases," he told me one evening as we cooked dinner together, "are the ones where the victims keep enabling the perpetrator because they love them. They'll sacrifice everything, their homes, their retirement, their other relationships, because they can't accept that someone they care about is taking advantage of them. When my parents' crisis hit and they asked me to mortgage my house, I called Marcus first. I was shaking as I explained the situation, half expecting him to tell me I was being too harsh, that family obligations were more important than financial prudence. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment before asking, "How many times has Derek asked them for money?" "This would be the 6th business," I admitted. "And how many times have they gotten their money back?" "Never." "Madison," Marcus said gently, "they're not asking you to help your brother. They're asking you to enable his pattern of financial abuse. And when your house is gone too, who do you think Derek will find to blame for not supporting the family?" That's when I knew Marcus truly understood. He wasn't just supporting my decision to say no. He was helping me see that saying no was the only healthy choice available. After I went no contact with my family, Marcus became my anchor. He never made me feel guilty for cutting them off or pressured me to reconcile before I was ready. When I had moments of doubt, wondering if I was being too harsh, he would remind me gently of everything I'd told him about the years of being overlooked and taken for granted. "You can't save people who don't want to be saved," he said one night when I was feeling particularly conflicted. "And you can't fix dysfunction by enabling it. All you can do is protect yourself and hope they eventually choose to get help." 6 months passed, 6 months of peace, of building a relationship with someone who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. 6 months of focusing on my career, watching Cloudbridge grow and succeed without the constant background stress of Derek's latest crisis. Marcus and I had been talking about moving in together, maybe taking the next step in our relationship. Cloudbridge had just signed a major contract with Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and I was being courted by several larger companies interested in acquisition. Life was good, better than it had ever been. And then, on a rainy Thursday evening in September, my doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, while Marcus reviewed case files at my dining room table. We'd fallen into comfortable domestic rhythms. Marcus would come over after work, we'd cook together, spend the evening talking about our days. It felt natural, easy, like we'd been doing it for years rather than months. The doorbell was unexpected. I wasn't expecting any deliveries, and my friends usually called before stopping by. I walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. My heart stopped. My parents stood on my front porch looking older and smaller than I remembered. Mum was clutching a worn suitcase, her hair grey and unkempt. Dad held a cardboard box, his shoulders hunched with defeat. Behind them, Derek stood with a large duffel bag, his usual confident swagger replaced by something that looked almost like shame. They looked exactly like what they were, homeless people seeking shelter from the rain. "Marcus," I called out, my voice barely steady. "Could you come here, please?" He appeared immediately, taking in my expression and moving to stand beside me. "What is it?" "My family," I whispered, pointing toward the peephole. "They're here." Marcus looked through the peephole himself, his expression hardening. "They look like they're planning to stay." The doorbell rang again, followed by persistent knocking. "Madison!" Mom's voice was muffled but desperate. "Madison, please. We know you're home. We just need to talk." "We lost the house," Dad's voice joined in. "We have nowhere else to go." I looked at Marcus, feeling 16 years old again, caught between wanting to help and knowing I shouldn't. "What do I do?" "That's up to you," Marcus said carefully. "But whatever you decide, I'm here." I took a deep breath and opened the door. The sight of them was even more shocking up close. Mum had lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Dad's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. Even Derek, who had always been impeccably groomed, looked dishevelled and defeated. "Madison," Mum whispered, tears immediately starting to flow. "Thank God. We didn't know where else to go." "The bank foreclosed 2 weeks ago," Dad said without preamble. "We've been staying in motels, but we ran out of money yesterday." "Derek came back from California," Mom added, as if this was good news. "He's going to help us figure everything out." I looked at Derek, who couldn't meet my eyes. "How did your sustainable energy project work out?" I asked. "It didn't," he said quietly. "The technology wasn't as scalable as I thought. So you're broke too." "Madison," Derek said, finally looking up, "I know you're angry with me, with all of us, but we're family, and right now we need—" "Stop," I interrupted. "Just stop. Before you say anything else, I want you to meet someone." I reached for Marcus's hand and pulled him forward. "Mom, Dad, Derek, I'd like you to formally introduce you to my husband, Marcus Williams." The word husband hit them like a physical blow. Mum's suitcase slipped from her hands and hit the porch with a dull thud. Dad's mouth fell open. Derek actually took a step backward. "Husband?" Mum whispered. "Madison, when did you—" "We didn't know you were even engaged." "We had a small ceremony 3 months ago," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Just close friends and a few colleagues, people who've actually been part of our lives." The implications hung in the air like smoke. They hadn't been invited because they weren't part of my life anymore. They'd lost the right to celebrate my milestones when they made it clear that my achievements didn't matter. "Congratulations," Dad said awkwardly, clearly struggling to process this information. "Marcus, was it? What do you do?" "I'm a senior partner at Hartwell & Associates," Marcus replied smoothly. "We specialize in corporate fraud and white-collar crime." Derek's face went pale. "Corporate fraud?" "Among other things," Marcus said, his tone professional but somehow menacing. We work closely with federal prosecutors on cases involving investment fraud, particularly schemes that target family members and elderly victims. The colour drained completely from Derek's face. Mum and Dad exchanged nervous glances. That's very interesting, Mum said weakly. Madison, could we possibly come inside? It's raining and we really need to talk. I looked at the three of them, my parents who had gambled away their security for Derek's dreams, and Derek himself who had finally run out of places to hide from the consequences of his actions. Actually, I said, before we go any further, there are some things you should know. Marcus, would you like to tell them about your current caseload? Marcus's expression was perfectly neutral, but I could see the steel underneath. Of course, I'm currently prosecuting several cases involving fraudulent investment schemes, Ponzi schemes, cryptocurrency fraud, fake blockchain platforms. It's fascinating work, really. The perpetrators often start with small frauds, maybe convincing family members to invest in non-existent businesses, and then escalate when they need more money to cover their losses. Derek was now visibly sweating despite the cool evening air. The interesting thing about these cases, Marcus continued conversationally, is how often the fraudsters convince themselves they're not really stealing. They genuinely believe their next scheme will pay everyone back, so they rationalize taking more and more money from people who trust them. That's not what happened here, Derek said quickly. My businesses were legitimate. They just didn't work out. All 6 of them? Marcus asked mildly, including the blockchain platform that you abandoned without paying back the investors. I didn't abandon anything, Derek protested. I'm still working on raising funds to pay back the loan. From California? Marcus asked. Because according to my contacts in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, there's no record of any legitimate business activity under your name in California, or Illinois for that matter. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek looked like he was about to be sick. My parents stared at Marcus with growing horror as they began to understand what he was really telling them. Derek, Dad said slowly, what is he talking about? Nothing, Derek said desperately. He's talking about nothing. My California project is still in development. It's all perfectly legal. Actually, Marcus said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a folded document, it's not. This is a federal warrant for your arrest, Derek. Wire fraud, securities fraud, and elder abuse. I was planning to have you served tomorrow, but since you're here... Derek bolted. He dropped his duffel bag and ran down my front steps, sprinting toward the street in the pouring rain. Marcus pulled out his phone and calmly dialed a number. This is Marcus Williams. The subject just fled on foot from the address we discussed. He's heading east on Lincoln Avenue, wearing a grey hoodie and jeans. My parents stood frozen on my porch, watching their golden child disappear into the darkness while federal agents surrounded my house. Madison, Mom whispered, what's happening? I don't understand what's happening. What's happening, I said gently, is that Derek has been running investment scams for years. The money you gave him for his businesses? He never invested it in anything legitimate. He used it to fund his lifestyle and pay back earlier investors, which is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. That's not possible, Dad said weakly. Derek wouldn't... He's not a criminal. He's just unlucky with business. Dad, I said, feeling sad rather than angry. Derek disappeared to California when his blockchain platform failed because he'd already spent all the money on other things. He never intended to pay you back because there was never any real business to begin with. 2 FBI agents appeared at the bottom of my driveway, escorting a handcuffed Derek between them. He was soaked from the rain, his head hanging in defeat. The sustainable energy project in California, I continued. Also fake. Derek's been living in a motel in San Francisco, running online poker games to make rent. Marcus's firm has been building a case against him for 6 months. 6 months? Mum asked numbly. We've been married for 3 months, I explained. We've been working together to stop Derek for 6 months. Marcus was investigating him long before we started dating. You've known all along, Dad said, understanding dawning in his eyes. You knew Derek was a fraud when we asked you for money. I suspected, I admitted, but I didn't have proof. And more importantly, it wouldn't have mattered if I'd told you. You wouldn't have believed me. They both knew I was right. If I'd tried to warn them about Derek 6 months ago, they would have accused me of being jealous, of trying to sabotage Derek out of spite. They would have chosen to believe Derek's lies over my concerns, just like they'd been doing for years. So you let us lose everything, Mum said, her voice broken. You could have stopped this, and you let us lose our home. No, I said firmly. Derek let you lose everything. I tried to warn you that the blockchain investment was insane. You chose not to listen. Derek took your money and disappeared. I chose not to enable his fraud by giving him access to my assets too. Marcus returned from speaking with the FBI agents, his expression grim. Derek's been running multiple schemes across 3 states. The total amount he's stolen is approaching $2 million, most of it from elderly investors and family members. 2 million, Dad whispered. Your 750,000 was just his latest score, Marcus explained. He's been doing this for years, using the money from each new victim to pay back earlier investors, just enough to keep them from getting suspicious. Classic Ponzi scheme behavior. But he's our son, Mom said desperately. He made mistakes, but he's not a bad person. He's just been struggling. Mrs. Coleman, Marcus said gently, Derek specifically targeted elderly investors because he knew they'd be more trusting and less likely to pursue legal action. He created fake business documents, forged investor contracts, and lied to federal investigators. This isn't someone making mistakes. This is someone systematically victimizing vulnerable people. The rain was getting heavier, and my parents were both shivering on my porch. They looked so small and broken that for a moment I felt my resolve wavering. These were the people who had raised me, who had loved me in their own flawed way. Now they were homeless and devastated, watching their son being arrested for federal crimes. Madison, Mom said quietly, I know we don't deserve your help. I know we chose Derek over you, and I know we hurt you, but we have nowhere to go. Could we please just stay tonight until we can figure out what to do next? I looked at Marcus, who nodded slightly. It was my decision, but he would support whatever I chose. You can stay tonight, I said finally. But we need to talk, really talk, about Derek, about our family, about everything that's led us to this moment. Relief flooded their faces as they picked up their bags and followed us inside. But I knew this conversation would be the hardest thing I'd ever done, because for the first time in my life, I was going to tell my parents exactly how their choices had affected me, without softening the truth to protect their feelings. We settled in my living room, my parents looking around at the comfortable home I'd built for myself. Marcus disappeared into the kitchen to make coffee, giving us privacy while staying close enough to intervene if needed. I want you to understand something, I began, looking at both my parents. When you asked me to mortgage my house to pay Derek's debt, you weren't asking me to help family, you were asking me to become Derek's next victim. That's not fair, Dad protested. We were going to pay you back. With what money? I asked. Derek was already gone, His business was already fake. Where exactly was the money going to come from to pay me back? They couldn't answer because there was no answer. They'd been so focused on solving their immediate crisis that they hadn't thought through the logistics of their plan. This is exactly what Derek does, I continued. He creates a crisis, convinces people who love him to solve it with their own money, and then disappears when the next crisis hits. The only difference is that this time you were asking me to be the next person he defrauded. We didn't know, Mom said weakly. We thought his business was real. You didn't want to know, I corrected. Derek has failed at 6 businesses in 10 years. 6. At what point do you stop calling it bad luck and start calling it a pattern? The silence stretched uncomfortably. You want to know why I really said no? I asked. It wasn't just about the money. It was because I finally realized that you'll never see Derek clearly as long as someone else is willing to clean up his messes. As long as there's always someone to bail him out, he'll never have to face the consequences of his choices. So you let us become homeless to teach us a lesson? Dad asked bitterly. I protected myself from becoming Derek's next victim, I said. You became homeless because you chose to gamble your house on someone with a track record of failure. Those are the consequences of your choices, not mine. Marcus returned with coffee, and the ritual of serving and stirring gave us all a moment to breathe. When he sat down beside me, I felt stronger, more grounded. There's something else you need to know, I said. Marcus and I didn't just get married. We've been planning our future together, and that future doesn't include cleaning up Derek's messes or enabling your denial about who he really is. What does that mean? Mom asked nervously. It means we're moving forward with our lives, Marcus said. Madison has built something incredible with CloudBridge. The company is being acquired by Google for $47 million. She's going to be very wealthy, very soon. My parents' eyes widened. I hadn't told them about the acquisition talks, partly because they'd been no contact, and partly because I'd learned not to share good news with people who couldn't celebrate it without immediately thinking about how it benefited them. 47 million, Dad whispered. And that's just the beginning, Marcus continued. Madison is brilliant, driven, and successful. She's going to continue building wealth and creating opportunities. But none of that success will be available to enable Derek's future schemes or fix the consequences of his past ones. You're cutting us off completely, Mum said, understanding the implications. We're setting boundaries, I corrected. You can be part of our lives, but only if you're willing to acknowledge reality about Derek and take responsibility for your own choices. No more asking me to fix problems he creates. No more expecting me to prioritize family dysfunction over my own well-being. He's still our son, Dad said stubbornly. And I'm still your daughter, I replied. But for 32 years, you've treated Derek's needs as more important than mine. You've missed my achievements, ignored my successes, and taken my stability for granted. Now Derek is going to federal prison, and you're homeless, and suddenly you remember that I exist. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which they were. That's not how we meant it, Mom said, tears starting again. It doesn't matter how you meant it, I said gently. That's how it was. And I'm not going to keep pretending it didn't hurt, or that it doesn't matter just to make you feel better about your choices. Marcus reached over and took my hand, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had someone who valued me, who celebrated my successes, who put my well-being first. I didn't need my parents' approval or love anymore. I had built a life full of people who actually cared about me. So what happens now? Dad asked. Now you figure out how to rebuild your lives without expecting me to fund it, I said. You find jobs, you find affordable housing, you learn to live within your means. You go to therapy and figure out why you enabled Derek's behaviour for so long. And maybe if you can do all that without making it my responsibility to fix or fund, we can start rebuilding our relationship. And Derek? Mum asked. Derek is going to prison, Marcus said matter-of-factly. Federal sentencing guidelines for fraud at this level typically result in 7 to 10 years. He'll probably serve 5 with good behaviour. The reality of it hit them like a physical blow. Their golden child, their brilliant entrepreneur, was going to spend the next 5 years in federal prison. All those years of sacrifice and support and belief had led to this moment. Derek in handcuffs, their house foreclosed, their retirement gone. I should have listened to you, Dad said quietly. About the blockchain investment, you tried to warn us. Yes, I agreed. You should have, but you didn't, because listening to me would have meant acknowledging that Derek might be wrong, and you've never been willing to do that. We're going to lose everything, Mum whispered. You already lost everything, I pointed out. Now you get to decide what you're going to build next, and whether you're going to build it based on reality or on more fantasies about Derek's potential. It was after midnight when my parents finally went to bed in my guest room. Marcus and I sat in our kitchen processing the evening's events. How do you feel? He asked. Exhausted, I admitted. But also relieved. I've been carrying their dysfunction for so long that I forgot how heavy it was. They're going to keep trying to pull you back in, Marcus warned. Guilt, manipulation, crisis after crisis. They'll test your boundaries constantly. I know, I said. But I also know I don't have to carry their problems anymore. I have you. I have my career. I have a life that isn't defined by Derek's failures or their refusal to see him clearly. Marcus smiled and pulled me closer. We have a life, he corrected, and it's going to be amazing. The next morning, my parents were gone. They'd left a note thanking me for the night's shelter and promising to respect my boundaries. They'd also left behind Derek's duffel bag, which contained nothing but dirty clothes and a burner phone with the numbers of several known fraudsters. I never saw Derek again. He pled guilty to federal fraud charges and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. My parents found jobs and a small apartment across town. We talked occasionally, stiff and careful conversations that gradually became more natural as they learned to relate to me as an adult daughter rather than a family ATM. 6 months later, Marcus and I were married again, this time with a real wedding, surrounded by friends and colleagues who celebrated our happiness without wondering what they could get from it. Cloudbridge's acquisition went through, making me wealthy beyond anything my teenage self could have imagined. I bought a larger house, not because I needed the space, but because I could. I started a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, remembering my own struggles with tuition after my parents chose Derek's dreams over my education. I invested in startups run by women and minorities, people whose brilliance often goes unrecognized in favor of flashier, less substantial ideas. But most importantly, I learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. Family is about people who show up for you, who celebrate your successes, who support you through difficulties without expecting you to sacrifice yourself for their problems. Marcus became my family. Our friends became our family. The team at Cloudbridge became our family. My parents occasionally ask about grandchildren, about holidays, about whether we might consider spending more time together. I answer honestly that we're building our lives around people who add value rather than drama, around relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Sometimes being the forgotten child was actually your greatest blessing. Sometimes being invisible to the wrong people makes you visible to the right ones. And sometimes the family you choose is worth infinitely more than the family you were born into. Have you ever realized that the people who claim to love you might actually be the ones holding you back from becoming who you're meant to be? Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to walk away from dysfunction, even when it shares your DNA. If this story reminded you that you're worth more than how your family treats you, please share it with someone who needs to hear this message. You deserve recognition, respect, and real love, not conditional acceptance based on what you can provide. And sometimes finding that love means having the courage to stop providing for people who take without giving back.